This change will naturally lead to conflict, though. And one of the first conflicts is the 1882 Soldiers Mutiny. What happened was, remember, Koreans were becoming more interested in Japan, and they were impressed with the Japanese military, so they hired Japanese officers to train a part of the Korean military. So they formed this, uh, basically, this Korean unit with a Japanese officer that was learning Japanese style of warfare, which was modern Western style of warfare. And the problem was that the Korean government didn't have a whole lot of money, and it's just spent most of its money for the military on this new unit and neglected the old Korean style units. And it wasn't paying them. And then when it finally paid them, it paid them with rice full of sand. Remember we talked about that earlier with corruption? So these Korean soldiers lead a little rebellion in which they attack and kill the Japanese officer in charge of the Korean Japanese style unit. And it's put down, but the Japanese, of course, are very upset. The Koreans have to pay them a lot of money because, they kill some Japanese citizens. But this shows how there's also growing in Korea a sense of anti-Japanese-ness, a sense of anti-modern, right? Why are we soldiers being neglected? Because they're treating the modern soldiers better. They're treating the officers with the soldiers with the Japanese officer better. Well, I don't like the Japanese. I don't like modern things. I want things to stay the same. And the problem is there's still a lot of corruption going on. Remember, you're going to have, as we'll see, you're going to have relatively weak king. And there's still, even with a strong king, there's always some corruption. But there's even more now. So you can see these problems you have in Korea. There's this fundamental conflict, right? Are the Japanese here to help us? Are they our friends? Are they our enemies? Or are they causing us problems? Is becoming modern good, or is being modern a threat to the way we do things in the past? And of course, corruption is always a problem. So as you can guess with this new conflict, there's going to be the formation of new factions. So one faction is going to be the pro-Chinese faction. Now, what I mean by pro-Chinese here is that there's going to be a faction that says we want Korea to be more like China. We want Korea to follow Chinese style of reforms. The leader of that faction is Queen Min, the wife of the king. Koreans now typically refer to her by her posthumous title, Myeongsung. I'm going to generally call her Myeongsung, but just so you know, if you're reading a book or something, they talk about Queen Min, it's the same person. But this faction is centered around the queen's family. We have something like in-law government, but it's not her father that dominates the king. It tends to be the queen. Myeongsung was a really clever lady and really tough, and probably more clever and tough than her husband. So she's going to be very important in Korean politics. It's unfortunate in a sense, though, that she chose to follow the pro-Chinese faction, because that's the faction that's not going to be as interested in reform. But in any case, there's reasons why she did that. But the pro-Chinese faction that looks to China is centered around Myeongsung. They're going to look to their traditional relationship with China. China is the protector. China is the model that Korea should follow. And they're going to try and take small reforms to maintain as much of the status quo as possible, because they lose with change, right? Her family is powerful Yongbon. They're very wealthy, especially thanks to their relationship with the king. A lot of her relatives will be in the government. They really don't want any significant change. Mostly they want to focus on bringing in some technology without significant social or political change, because they lose with change. They're connected to the old order. They don't want to change. And when you think of the old order with minimizing change, you think of China. Another faction, though, of course, that will develop will be the pro-Japanese faction. It is centered around younger officials and others with exposure to Japan, people who saw Japan and were impressed by it. They want more radical reform. They want to make all these changes that Japan has made. And to be, we naturally tend to look at them and say, well, they're the good guys because they're the reformers. But remember, they win with change. A lot of the ones who want radical reforms are people who are marginalized intellectuals. They're people whose fathers, whose mothers were like remarried widows who were they're oftentimes the sons of concubines. They're people who have educations, but who were kept out of the traditional power struggle. So it's important for us to understand we can't really separate the quest for power and ideology here. People tend to follow ideologies that benefit them. But these radical reformers are people who are lower officials typically, who are from backgrounds that would benefit from having massive change. The key leader is this man, Kim Il-kyun, right? Kim Il-kyun. He is going to be the key leader. This faction is comparatively weak, right? You can see that, right? One faction is centered around the queen, who, as I said, is a really clever, strong lady. This faction is mostly younger officials who are kind of on the margins anyway. And they're afraid that they will be crushed. They're afraid that the pro-Chinese faction is going to come in and try and destroy them, so they decide that they need to act first. They decide they need to act quickly, and so in 1884, they're going to launch what's called the Gabsin Coup. What's funny is Gabsin just means 1884, basically. So it's the 1884 coup. But basically their goal is to seize control of the king and then rule through him. That's the goal, right? So this pro-Japanese faction wants to seize control of the king and rule through him. It's similar to what happened in the Meiji Restoration, to be honest. The Koreans are kind of taking a playbook from what the Japanese did, the samurai did. And it's kind of similar, right? You have lower officials trying to restore, trying to gain power over the king. In Japan, you had the lower samurai trying to put the emperor back in charge. But what's going to happen is these pro-Japanese officials will actually talk to the Japanese consul, who's kind of like an ambassador. So he's a Japanese official who's a diplomat in Korea. And they tell him, we want to launch a coup. Will you support us if we do? Will you send soldiers to support us? And the Japanese ambassador says, or consul says, yes, we will support you. We will send you soldiers if you need them. And so what happens is there is the opening of a new post office. Korea is going to open a modern post office. And basically what they do, there's going to be a banquet to open the post office. And what these reformers do is they assassinate a lot of the pro-Chinese officials who are attending the banquet. Basically what they do, and there's a reason why there's a fire there, all these conservative pro-Chinese officials are at the banquet, and then one of the pro-Japanese officials shouts, hey, there's a fire, and as the pro-Chinese Korean officials run out, they stab them with swords and chop them up as they run out of the banquet. So not the most subtle thing to do, but it does allow them to, for a time, seize control of the king, and they will launch 3 days of reform. They will have 3 days where, thanks to the Japanese troops they have and thanks to the fact that they control the king, they're able to launch a reform. But then the Chinese will invade Korea, send thousands of troops to drive the Japanese out. And I say invade, but I think the Korean king was glad that they did this. I don't think the Korean king was particularly happy about this. But the Japanese forces are driven out by superior numbers of Chinese troops. So you can see the very serious situation Korea is in, right? Now they've got Japanese and Chinese troops duking it out in their country, each supported by different factions. So you've got this very serious conflict in Korea. Kim Il-kyun will manage to escape to Japan. We'll come back to him later. And this almost leads to a war between China and Japan. Right? This almost leads to a war between China and Japan, but not yet. Similar things will happen that will lead to a war in 1894. I do want to note this is when Protestant Christianity will really gain more official tolerance. So I mentioned to you earlier that Protestant Christianity will be tolerated. The government will come to support it because it promises to offer modern institutions like schools and hospitals. But it's really an amazing story of how Protestant Christianity got support from the government. And I have to tell you the story because it's like something out of a novel. So this man, Horace Allen, was a medical missionary, right? He was a medical missionary, and he was a Methodist, right? So he's a Methodist, he's a Protestant Christian, he's a medical missionary, and he's sent to Korea as a missionary. He's the first Methodist missionary to Korea. But the problem is, it's illegal to be a missionary in Korea when he first goes there. So he enters Korea as a doctor working for the American diplomat there. Right? That's how that's his cover, is that he's a diplomat, but secretly he's a missionary. So and it became basically an open secret that the guy was really a missionary. I mean, the government knew what he was up to. They just kind of hid, pretended they didn't notice, because he really wasn't doing much. He was just trying to learn the language. He wasn't really able to go out and convert anyone. But so remember, there was this banquet where where the pro-Japanese people launched their assassination attempt as part of their coup attempt, right? So they claimed that there was a fire at the banquet. The conservative pro-Chinese officials are running out, and they cut them up with swords. One of the ones who got cut up was this guy Min Yong-ik, and he was a nephew of Queen Min. And everyone thought he was going to die because he had been cut up with swords. Now, Korean medicine at this time could actually treat a lot of illnesses pretty well. It wasn't good at surgery. So Horace Allen, as a Western doctor, was called in in an attempt to save Min Yong-ik's life, and he managed to do so. Right? This guy had been stabbed multiple times with swords. He was going to die, but Horace Allen, using Western medicine, was able to save his life. So obviously, you can guess, this led to the Queen, who was very powerful, really liking Protestant Christian missionaries. And this led over time to government support for Protestant Christian missionaries, because they had shown in concrete fashion the benefits that Western civilization had to offer, in this case, surgery. So, fascinating story I had to tell. I just also want to note, wow, this guy is really, Horace Allen knew how to dress, right? This is some good looking stuff. So here's the thing. This was a brutal battle between the pro-Chinese and pro-Japanese factions, but the pro-Chinese faction is still standing. A bunch of them got killed, but they're still around, right? The pro-Japanese faction, more of them get killed. Kim Il-kyun, their leader, is driven away. So this allows China between 1885 and 1894 to gain more power. And this is going to lead to a change in Korea's relationship with China. Whereas before, remember, China had treated Korea like an independent country as its younger brother. But increasingly, China is going to be following modern Western forms of imperialism and basically attempt to make Korea its colony. For example, China will gain control over the Koreans' customs service. The customs service is who's in charge of collecting the tariff and other things like that. It's in charge of collecting taxes related to trade. The Chinese will control that, though technically speaking, they hire British people to run it for them. So it's very complex. So the customs service of Korea is run by British people working for China. But the key thing is here, you've got a very important modern institution that the Chinese will control. The Chinese will also build and control Korea's telegraph system, which allows them to control Korean communications. And sometimes when the Korean government wants to send a message that the Chinese don't like, the message doesn't get sent. And the Chinese will do their very best to keep Western countries from being able to do anything in Korea in terms of business or do work for the Korean government and get paid for doing that work. And of course, the Chinese will watch what officials are being appointed in Korea to make sure that only pro-Chinese officials get government jobs. And at times they will interfere with Korean diplomacy. Koreans will try and establish, continue the relations with Japan, the United States, Russia, and China will try and tell them, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And they actually send an official, a guy named Yoon Shikai, to Korea in an effort to make sure that the Koreans do what they're told. So, and they will follow this policy of encouraging self-strengthening, which is this idea of adopting Western technology without making other significant changes. So politics stays the same, society stays the same, you just get Western guns. And the guy in charge of this is a man named Yoon Shikai. So I want to stress, China here is really kind of making Korea its colony. If this would have continued, Korea may have become a colony of China. Right? We'll see later it doesn't happen. But key here for our purposes, this is the wrong model to follow. This is not the model to power. It's the Japanese model that should be followed. Whether Korea could have followed that model or not is not clear. What is clear is they did not. They're going to follow the Chinese model, and that's going to cause problems later on.